has very little authority. But in our case, it does. So even if you have a situation like today where one party holds the presidency and a decently strong majority in one of the bodies of the legislature, the other party holds the other body, so it's very difficult to get stuff through. And then lastly, of course, as we know very well from last year, we have this supermajority requirement in the Senate, so that even if one party holds the presidency, the House of Representatives, and 59 seats, an enormous majority in the Senate, it may not be able to get anything passed. The Democrats had for about a year in 2009 60 seats in the Senate until the special election was held to fill Ted Kennedy's seat, and then they held 59 seats. And it was very difficult to pass stuff in 2010, even before they lost the House in the November 2010 election. The importance of this structure of our political system arguably is accentuated by the fact that we now have two much more cohesive political parties than we used to. The two political parties in the U.S., you're probably all aware of this, used to be kind of grab bags ideologically. That was kind of a function of the legacy of the Civil War in the South. So the Democrats were this sort of weird conglomeration of somewhat liberal folks in the Northeast and the West Coast with very conservative people who were nonetheless part of the Democratic Party in the South. Republicans were this kind of odd coalition of more conservative in the Midwest and the West, and then a lot of Rockefeller Republicans in the Northeast. So despite all these obstacles in the structure of the political system, arguably, up until recently, it was possible for each of the parties to kind of pick off a few sympathetic folks in the other party to get stuff passed in certain circumstances, whether it was the 1930s or the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s. Arguably, that's much more difficult now, because the parties are much more cohesive, much more disciplined. This is especially true of Republicans, but it may be true, we may see this increasingly develop among the Democrats too. They were fairly cohesive in the mid-2000s before they won back the House in the 2006 elections. So arguably it's going to be tougher and tougher for either party to get anything done unless in fact they hold all three of these things: 60 votes in the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And that almost never happens. It happened in 2009 when they lost the 60 seats with the special election in early 2010. It happened back in the late 1970s, but it's very, very rare, and probably will be pretty rare going forward. Okay, so this actually is I think, a very big obstacle. It's exactly right to worry about this. I think of the things that I've talked about here, I think this is the biggest threat to my optimism about a sort of slow but steady movement towards an expanded government role in the coming period. But I also simply want to point out, two things. First of all, despite this, stuff does happen occasionally. Good policy gets through. We rarely have big waves like the 1930s. You know, many people dream of, not in terms of the economic chaos and downturn, but in terms of the policy advance. Lots of people dream of some sort of revisitation of the 1930s, or maybe the mid-1960s. Those periods are pretty rare. But in the meantime, good stuff does occasionally happen, whether it's the S-chip program that expanded access to health insurance in the late 1990s, the earned income tax credit, which was created in the mid-70s and then steadily expanded in the 80s and early 1990s, or the healthcare reform more recently, finally passed in early 2010. The other thing is, the abundance of veto points in our political structure also is an asset. Because like with public opinion that gets attached to good policy and then acts as a brake against those who would like to get rid of these policies or cut them back or let them sort of erode over time, the veto points also help. It makes it much more difficult for people like Paul Ryan or Newt Gingrich, let's say, who would aggressively like to dramatically change some of the very key policies that do a lot of good in providing opportunity or the safety net. It makes it difficult for them to do that. Not impossible. Okay, this can happen, but it does make it very difficult. It's much easier for the left, the Democrats, or anyone who's in favor of keeping these policies in place to do that, even if they're in the minority for a short period or a longer period. Okay, because I've gone way over time, I'm not going to bother with the summary. I'm just going to stop there and try to take whatever questions you might have. Yes, please.
Yes. Do you see that the Occupy Wall Street movement is going to affect our political outcomes here?
I think it might. I think what the Occupy movements have clearly done is created a lot of attention among journalists to the issue of income inequality that wasn't there before. I'm not sure how much this has influenced American public opinion about even income inequality, much less anything else. I'm not sure how much influence the Occupy movements are going to have if they don't get involved in electoral politics, or some spin-off version of them gets involved in electoral politics in the way that, for example, the Tea Party movement morphed from a kind of protest movement into one that was and is very actively involved in electoral politics. So I think the short answer is it remains to be seen. I really don't know. A lot depends on how things change or don't change. Oh, you've already asked what's in the, yeah, let me go ahead. I'll come back to you.
Is there any way to compare waste in government versus waste in the private sector? This is something that I don't know too much. There are some measures. There are social scientists who try to do this kind of thing. Although oftentimes waste is sort of lumped in together with corruption. There's a lot of interest among social scientists in government corruption. So broadly speaking, it's sort of bad government performance, but waste on the one hand, or inefficiency, is often combined with outright corruption. And what you're asking, I think, is you like the two things to be separated. And so I'm not as familiar as I probably should be with the actual measures that are used, but I do know that some social scientists are trying to work on this. Measures of good government, if you will, the kind of converse or other side of waste. Thank you.
So, from an economist's point of view, one of the things that have really changed the scenario right now seems to be the issue of debt. And the word debt seems to be driving political opinions and political decision-making all over the place. In Europe as now, and in America, even the president talks about debt reduction. And whereas before, and isn't that directly related to the so-called welfare state or government, big government? So, we're looking at Europe, and those on the right are saying, pointing the finger and saying, hey, it's the government that did it, they overspent. And guess what? We don't want more taxes. So Americans have got this fixation about no higher taxes, we don't want to pay for it, and at the same time, we want to reduce the debts, and we don't want to spend more. And I think there's a big push right now, and one of the reasons why the Tea Party, for instance, has become so popular is because of this fear factor that, we're spending too much money, we can't afford it.
I think that's right. I would just encourage, what I've tried to talk about here is medium and long run developments. And I think it's really important to separate that from the issues of the day. So there are always issues that come up in the mid-1990s, for example, welfare reform, which arguably was an important threat or movement in the opposite direction from what I'm suggesting here. At various points in time in the last several decades, crime has been one of the foremost issues on people's minds. Reform of the tax system comes up occasionally. At the moment, it's debt. And this is not to say that what's important in the short run can't end up being important in the long run, but simply to say that it tends not to. My best guess is that although debt has been at the forefront of debates in the US and Western Europe, Western Central Europe, the EU broadly, for roughly the last year and a half, probably that'll come to pass. Now, I might be wrong. It might be an issue that scars debates for a generation in the way that stagflation and the income slowdown kind of did in the United States from the 1970s, and certainly in the way that the Depression did in the 1930s. I mean, it really had almost a stranglehold over American politics for a full generation. Democratic candidates were still running against Herbert Hoover in the 1950s and 1960s. And so it's possible that debt will take on the force that these did, especially if, let's say, the EU collapses, or
the euro collapses and maybe the EU breaks apart in some ways, and then moves back into recession, which prolongs our recession. And so we've already been since 2008 without pulling out. If we go another 3, 4, 5 years, this will, in all likelihood, be a very, very scarring period. And so it could be that debt dominates. Debt and our failure to get out of it by spending less. And that's, of course, one story that's crafted about what to do about our debt problem. It could be that dominates the narrative for a long time. I very much hope not. I suspect that debt will be like most other issues. Very important right now, but not necessarily driving what happens over the medium or long run.
Yeah, there seems to be, or not seems to be, it's obvious that the conservative element in Congress is banging away at disassembling our environmental laws. And they say they're job killers. I mean, that's their mantra. But what effort are the economists using to come up with some evaluation of what the value is of our environmental laws? Like, I can visualize greatly improved public health. Why isn't that considered in some way in our evaluating the benefits of these laws to counter these arguments that we hear?
Right. Well, it is. What happens with American politics, and this is true to some extent, although I think to a lesser extent in many other affluent nations, is that policymakers pick and choose the studies. You can find on almost any issue you want a study done by someone. It doesn't even have to be a credible academic or a credible scholar, whether they're academics or not. You can find a study that will support, for example, the notion that environmental regulations are job killers. You can also misinterpret the results of a study that provide only partial support. So, for example, there's a very common tactic that policymakers and academics do this sometimes too, will use, whereby you might find that some factor, let's say it's regulations, have some effect on an outcome of interest. Let's say it's job creation. And thereby you trumpet this simple causality. So you say, look, I found this study that shows that larger or more stringent regulations reduce job creation over the next 5 years. Well, it could be that what the study found is that, yes, that's in fact true, but the effect is really, really minimal. It's tiny. But of course, if I, as a policymaker, want to brandish or further the view that environmental regulations are job killers, I'm not going to bother mentioning that the magnitude of the impact is really small. I'm just going to say there's an impact. You see this, another example of this is the minimum wage. There are studies that have found that when you increase the minimum wage, it can slow job creation. Now, mind you, most studies actually don't find that, given our past experience. When we increase the minimum wage, it tends to be by a very small amount, and it very likely has almost no effect at all on future job creation. But there are some studies that have found an effect. The thing is, it tends to be really, really small. And often the gain to people who are working in minimum wage jobs far outweighs the job loss. But if I want to say, if I want to argue against an increase in the minimum wage, I can perfectly well say, look, I found this study and it shows that when we increase the minimum wage, it slows job creation. Not mentioning the fact that the effect is really, really tiny. So the point is simply that economists and other social scientists have done quite a bit of study on this. And of course it depends exactly on the regulation. This is not my area of expertise, but my reading is to suggest that most regulations within the realm of those that currently exist or are on the table in terms of being proposed are very unlikely to do much damage to job growth. The problem is the political debate. It's not the lack of scientific study.
Well, sort of last question in relation to that. Take mercury. Currently there's a big issue about regulating coal power plant mercury emissions. I can see we're going to have a tremendous public health effect where if we don't eliminate mercury, we're going to continue to have a number of negative effects on society, which can result in lower productivity, lower IQs, greater sickness, greater costs. And that seems to never get into the arguments. I mean, they all talk about quality of life, but they don't talk about just the economic aspect. Okay, well, I stop there.
One thing to bear in mind, and you're probably all aware of this anyway, but it's worth emphasizing, is that arguments about job creation effects tend to have much more weight in a bad economic period. So if the economy were humming along, if we were in a situation like we were in 1998, 99, those types of arguments would have much less force in terms of swaying public opinion or policy debates. Let me go ahead.
I just wanted to try and weld that last question with the previous one together and talk about corporate waste and what we don't pay attention to as a cost. I think, in generally speaking, the external costs of doing of private enterprise doing anything are usually either ignored, or when there's an outcry, as in Love Canal, they're shoved off onto the government. And the government is blamed for the expenditures in cleaning up messes left by corporations who don't figure social costs into their cost of production. Does that sound like a reasonable construction to you?
Yeah, I think there is a lot to that tendency, and it's of course shaped by a lot of argument. I mean, one of the things that I hope you take away from my talk, at least in terms of my point of view, whether you believe it or not, is that I actually think that public opinion probably matters less in terms of influencing our policy than most of us tend to think. We get very absorbed in how the debates are portrayed by journalists, what we see in sound bites on cable TV and in presidential debates and political speeches and so on. And it's utterly natural, it's perfectly natural for us to think that, look, this is the most important thing. Let me just go back and I'll leave this up. I just want to leave this chart up. And I don't want to suggest that public opinion or the rhetoric or the evidence that's brought to bear or the types of arguments that's made by either side or by industry lobbyists, this doesn't matter. I just think we tend to way overestimate the extent to which it matters in the end in determining elections and the long run of policy. I think it's really important to debate about these things and to try to shape the argument to the extent you can, but ultimately it's really striking the degree to which at least presidential elections come down to the state of the economy. Now, there will always be exceptions to the rule. So, here and then.
Just sort of a observation on my part about how the Republicans are obstructing the easy accessibility to demographic voting indicates they're very insecure, and with considering the growing Hispanic population, that they see the handwriting on the wall, in my opinion. Maybe not immediately, but the time is coming.
Well, certainly it's true that that both parties and those who are active in and around the two parties have wanted and will continue to try to want to do everything they can to make every little bit of difference in the election. And to sort of buttress this point and make a caveat with respect to what I'm saying here about the overriding importance of the economy, let's not forget this election right here, 2000. You know, if you ever doubt that despite this sort of broad economic determinist story I'm telling you here, that every little vote counts, just think back to 2000, when in fact it all came down to one state, and in fact, you know, let's say hypothetically that the Democrats had been better organized in either Florida or Ohio, there wouldn't have been that dispute. The Democratic candidate, of course, did win a majority of the popular vote, but didn't end up winning the election. So in the broad sweep of things, the economy determines an awful lot, but that's not to discount all kinds of local and seemingly very small-scale efforts to do everything you can to ensure that your party or candidate gets as many votes as you want. And what Republicans are trying to do with respect to voting rights and voter access is certainly very much in that vein. And you know, I don't particularly like it given my own inclinations, but it doesn't surprise me, and I think it's probably smart for them to try to do that. I see it as unfortunate.
But the Democrats, I haven't seen them do that.
Well,
About the South.
Well, for a while.
It'll happen, yeah.
I'll leave that to the rest of you who know much more about local organizing than I do to render your judgment on that. We have one other. Go ahead.
With respect to your last point, public opinion versus policy. How do you see social networking fitting into your conclusion? And have you or has anybody studied the phenomena of social networking with respect to your thesis?
Yeah, so the question is, what difference, if any, will social networking make into the story I'm telling here? I haven't thought much about this specifically. I guess I'll just say one thing with respect to that. I see, we were talking about this, some of us, a little bit at dinner last night. An additional worry, on top of the three that I've focused on here, about this notion that there's a fighting chance for government to expand rather than contract or stay the same in coming decades. An additional worry has to do with the seemingly growing role of money in American politics. So you have, over the last couple of decades, of course, this growing concentration of income. We have more and more of a winner-take-all society, with those at the top getting a larger and larger share of all the income. And then we have this sort of steady development, really accelerated, at least potentially, by the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which leads to a lot less regulation of the flow of private money into electoral campaigns. And won't that be an important obstacle to creation of new government programs to fill in these needs in our society, or expansion of existing programs? Yes, possibly. But as I was suggesting to some last night, I think another way to think about this, another plausible pattern that we might observe, is that there are diminishing returns to money in politics. So money clearly matters in terms of influencing policy and influencing election outcomes. But probably once you get to a certain level, there's only so much more another $1 billion can do. Less than the first billion, let's say. And social networking, in the way that, for example, the Obama campaign utilized that creatively in 2008, is one of a variety of offsetting mechanisms, potentially offsetting mechanisms. Ways that, first of all, more money can be generated from the non-rich. And then secondly, that more people can be excited and activated to get out and get involved in politics, and maybe get more people to the voting booth at the end of the day, or on election day. So I don't mean to suggest that we shouldn't worry about the growing influence, the growing amount of money and the influence that's likely to have on American politics, but just to suggest that there are some potentially offsetting mechanisms, and if we use them very well, that maybe we're not doomed by the coupling of growing income inequality and the implications of the Citizens United decision.
You want to do one more question, or are we going to?
I'm happy to. Depends on.
Does anybody else have a question?
Yes. Recognizing that government programs over time become entrenched because they develop a constituency, not just in the public, but in the federal legislature, the legislative body. We have good programs that we all recognize as being good, Social Security, Medicare, and we want to keep those. How do you suggest we get rid of programs that are considered wasteful? I'm thinking of farm subsidies for corporations, for corporate farms, because they too have developed a constituency. Also among the public, the corporations that receive the money, as well as the federal legislators who represent them. How do we get rid of those programs?
It's a really good question, and it's an important question, I think, because Democrats always face the charge, or let's say the left faces the charge, and this is true in other countries too, but maybe more so here in the United States, that all you want to do is expand government, just for its own sake, or at least the kind of underlying implication is that you must want to do it just for its own sake, because you don't really work very hard to get rid of the bad programs while you're trying to expand the good ones or create new good ones. So it's a real concern, and the truth is, exactly in the way that public opinion, vested interests, and the structure of the political system make it hard, fortunately, to get rid of good programs or to cut them back, they also make it hard to get rid of bad programs. Farm subsidies are the classic example. Of course, rural states are way overrepresented in our Senate relative to the population, and couple that with the filibuster practice, and it's pretty easy to see why, even if there were very strong public sentiment and most policymakers could agree that we ought to cut these things back, maybe get rid of some of them altogether, it would be hard to do. This could be blocked just through the Senate. And there are very likely many other examples along those lines. So I don't have any easy solution. The thing to do is to state pretty clearly that there are programs that aren't doing that great a job. I think the federal government's role in the post office is likely to be debated. It's already being debated, but it's likely to be debated pretty heavily in the next 5 years or so. It's on the table. Now, which side you come down on that, whether you think it's a program that could be usefully transferred more to the private sector, I leave it to you to decide. I'll just point out that in many other rich countries that have much more generous programs than we do in terms of safety net and expanding opportunity, they've already privatized their postal service. I'm not suggesting it's a bad program, but it's an example of one where there ought to be a debate. And knee-jerk attitudes about opposing any and all cutbacks to government spending are not very productive, not very helpful, and not very wise in the long run politically.
Well, we want to thank you for coming and talking.